Boy Scout camp in the Sierras, camping 10 miles from the main camp. 10 years old, under the stars. You could only see 10 feet away. The remainder of the camp was at least 50 yards away through the trees. I picked this spot with a few buddies to avoid the consequences of everyone eating beans for dinner that I knew would fill the camp after our chilly dinner. The year 2 to 3 people had been killed by mountain lions in California. A pink gumball of a boy, I lay back tucked in my bag watching the satellites tiptoe across the stars, looking through the dark pine canopy like a TV screen in a dark room. I hear soft footsteps creeping along the tree line. My friends are asleep. I sit up in the cold dark and peer toward the noise, only seeing a floating branch sticking out of a velvet curtain. Pat, pat, pat. The sound steadily moves, just behind the black curtain of dark, 15 feet away to my left-hand side. Up, over my shoulder, behind my head, around to the right, even past my feet, the direction other campers are in. But I cannot see anything. It must be my imagination, right? Just pine cones falling. After a few minutes, I think it stopped. I'm so scared I have to pee. So I go just a couple of feet away to the edge of the dark and pee in 3 places, marking my territory. I get back in my bag, clutching my little pocket knife and big flashlight. Pat, pat, to the right. Pat, pat, pat. And the left. Pat, off past my feet. Pat, pat, back behind my head. Pat, pat, rustle, crack. Then I hear a yell, the loudest, shrillest scream I'd ever heard. It came from just a few feet away. "Shut up," one of the adults down in the camp yell, acting like it's kids screwing around, knowing full well it's not here at 3 a.m. The morning rolls around. We found tons of tracks around me, some fur and some blood. Luckily, a second mountain lion had started stalking me. The 2 of them got in a fight that night, and they scared each other off. I've hunted turkeys for years, mostly in Oklahoma, in spots local to me. I'm an Okie born and raised. Anyway, this happened a while back when I was a young man. Right at the start of turkey season, in a spot I got permission to hunt. I pulled up way before daylight, parked off of a dirt road, and walked into the woods. If you know turkey hunting, it's a game of patience. Get set up, get quiet, start calling, and wait. I set my decoys out in a small clearing and tucked myself back against a big old oak tree. Morning mist was clinging to everything, real thick that day. Kinda eerie and a bit out of the ordinary for the place I was hunting. Once it was time, I did a few soft yelps on my call, just trying to coax a longbeard in. Not 5 minutes later, I heard a distant gobble. Adrenaline kicked in. Then, right after that, I heard something else, crying, like human crying, faint, but enough to stop me dead. At first, I thought it had to be a weird bird I'd never heard, or maybe a coyote making a racket. I've heard coyotes make some freaky noises when they get riled up, so I shook it off and kept hunting. But then, it came again, clearer this time. It wasn't an animal, it was human. It sounded like a baby or a real small kid crying somewhere behind me in the trees. At that point, I was concerned. I figured maybe someone's kid had wandered off from one of the houses around there or something. You never know. It did sort of scare me, but I was more worried that a kid was in the woods alone and by themselves. I have nieces, nephews, and younger cousins, so it stirred something in me. I got my gun and started picking my way through the brush, following the sound. I kinda had to fight my way through a briar patch and some cedars, which isn't ever fun. But it was definitely crying that I was hearing. I finally came to an old oak tree. It was twisted all up, old as hell, Looked like it had been struck by lightning at some point. There was a hollow near the base, big enough to crawl into if you wanted to. The crying sounded like it was coming from inside that hollow. I just stood there, heart pounding, trying to see anything in the dark hole. I was honestly trying to work up the courage to look inside, but before I could even take a step closer, the crying stopped. Like someone had flipped off a switch. Dead silence. I backed up real slow. I didn't turn my back until I got some distance between me and that tree. I started to call my dad, but the whole thing left me feeling crazy. I felt like I imagined it, but I know what I heard. I grabbed my gear and hiked out fast. I didn't even hunt the rest of the day. A month or two later, I was talking to a buddy of mine at his house. We were getting ready to go fishing, and his uncle was out there holding court around the tailgate of his truck. We got to talking, and I told him about it, and he got real quiet. He's full-blood Seminole. I'm not sure how familiar you folks are with Oklahoma's history, but the Seminoles were one of the tribes sent here in the 1800s, and I was hunting some land that would have been theirs, and an area they would have settled in. Anyways, he explained quietly, almost reverently, that the Seminole people traditionally buried stillborn babies in the hollows of trees, believing the trees protected the tiny souls until they could pass on peacefully. I still get chills thinking about it. I don't think what I heard was trying to scare me. I think it just was, like an old sadness still hanging around. When I'm in the woods, I still think of that tree sometimes, and the tiny voice held gently within. It reminds me that even places we believe we know intimately can hold mysteries beyond our understanding, and that not every unexplained sound in the wild is meant to harm us. I've thought about it a lot, and the best I can come up with is that some things are simply meant to be remembered, respected, and left in peace. Has anyone else heard anything similar? I am a very normal, simple 41-year-old guy with zero history of any mental illness, apart from a little bit of anxiety. No bad medical history, drug use, or whatever else. I drank in my teens and 20s when I would go out to bars and stuff, but I never had any bad habits or anything like that. Anyway, it started when I was 5 or 6, which would have been 1988 to 1989. I would see what I called the bloody man walking up and down the stairs in my house. I can't remember his face. I'm not sure if it's because I never looked at it or if he didn't have one. I just remember it would never be the middle of the night, but more like bedtime that this would always happen. He had a bandage on his head that was bloody and a hospital gown. I remember having a feeling that I knew this wasn't right, but I wasn't scared. I'm not sure if the lack of fear was due to being told not to be scared somehow, or if I was so young I just didn't know to be scared. This person I would see, I would come to learn later in life, was my uncle. He had been beaten in the head with a baseball bat, came home, brain swelled in his sleep, and was taken to the hospital by family in the morning, where he died several days later. This was August of 1982. I was born in December of 1983. There's much more to the story, both his life and the night itself, but I'll hold off on that for now. I saw the bloody man somewhere in the range of 15 to maybe 30 times. Then my mom and I moved out of there to get our own place. This was my grandfather's house, and I was gone for 5 years. Around 12 or 13 years old, I moved back to that house. While I never saw that bloody man again, it was far from the last paranormal encounter I would have in that house. After being back around 5 to 6 months or so, one day I was showing my little sister how to play a Sonic the Hedgehog game, and as I'm explaining it to her, as clear as day, a female voice says her name. My sister instantly got up and went to the door and said, Yeah, Ma? And I was frozen solid in fear. This was for two reasons. The first was I knew for a fact that that wasn't my mom's voice that said my sister's name. It was my grandmother's, who had been dead for 10 years. The second thing, I knew that my little sister didn't seem to realize the voice had not come from downstairs. It came from right at our feet, by the foot of the bed. I just sat there, frozen in fear, while my sister yelled for my mom, who of course said she had been washing dishes and never called her. My sister then sulked while walking back to bed. "What's the matter?" I asked her. "I hate those stupid stairs. The bloody man is scary," she replied. So I started asking her who had told her about the bloody man. Was it any of my friends or what? She was in shock that I knew who the bloody man was, and was crying for me to believe her that she really sees him. And none of my friends had spilled the secret to her. She was about 5 at this time, about the same age I used to see him. The next part of this story involves all of my friends. Every sleepover, after hearing my grandmother's voice, my bedroom door started shaking. Thinking it might be my stepfather, we would open it as it was shaking, and no one would be standing there. Upon realizing this, the shaking would terrify us, so every sleepover for about a year, the door would shake, and these horrible claw-like scratching sounds would go down the door. My friends and I would fight to hide in the corner on the bed while it would happen. So, if you're keeping count, that's my sister and myself, who both saw the bloody man and heard the female voice, and then 3 of my friends who witnessed the shaking and clawing at the door. 5 people. But believe it or not, the last part of the story gets even crazier. We sold the house and moved a couple of cities over about a year later. One thing I forgot to mention is the reason I moved back at 12 to 13 is that my grandfather had a bunch of mini strokes, and he was in a wheelchair, so my mom moved back in to take care of him. Well, after we moved away, I told my mom it surprised me that she sold her childhood house, and she talked about all the bad memories she had there that had replaced the good. And then she said, plus Grampy started creeping me out towards the end. It turns out he'd started telling her, "Your brother's still here, every night, up and down those damn stairs, up and down, up and down." He saw the bloody man too, his son. But that's not the craziest part. About 7 to 8 years after selling the house, the guy that bought it saw my uncle in a gym and beelined it towards him, demanding to know, what the hell is in that house? He, his wife, and 2 of his kids kept seeing my uncle around the house. I made it a point to walk by the house to try to catch someone coming out once I heard the gym story, and one day I caught the youngest son leaving. I introduced myself and asked him about what they saw, and he said he was too young at the time, but his mom, his dad, and 2 brothers would always see my uncle behind them in mirrors in the house. They got rid of the mirrors and it stopped, he said. I don't quite understand that part because mirrors had nothing to do with it for me, but still, that's 3 people in my family, 3 friends, and 4 people of a different family that essentially saw the same thing or heard it. I'd give anything to learn exactly what the hell went on in that house all those years ago. Anyway, that's my story. For the past 2.5 years now, I've been living in the north of the Scottish Highlands, and when I say north, I mean as far north as you can possibly go. I live in a region called Caithness, in the small coastal town of Thurso, which is actually the northernmost town on the British mainland. I had always wanted to live in the Scottish Highlands, which seemed a far cry from my gloomy hometown in Yorkshire, England, and when my dad and his partner told me they'd bought an old house up here, I jumped at the opportunity. From what they told me, Caithness sounded like the perfect destination. There were seals and otters in the town's river, dolphins and orcas in the sea, and at certain times of the year, you could see the northern lights in the night sky. But despite my initial excitement of finally getting to live in the Scottish Highlands, full of beautiful mountains, amazing wildlife, and vibrant culture, I would soon learn the region I had just moved to was far from the idyllic destination I had dreamed of. So many tourists flood here each summer, but when you actually choose to live here, in a harsh and freezing coastal climate, this place feels more like a purgatory. More than that, this place actually feels cursed. This probably just sounds like superstition on my part, but would almost convince me of this belief, more so than anything else here, is that disturbing things have washed up on shore, each one supposedly worse than the last, and they all have to do with death. The first thing I discovered here happened maybe a couple of months after I first moved to Caithness. In my spare time, I took to exploring the coastline around the Thurso area. It was on one of these days that I started to explore what was east of Thurso. On the right-hand side of the mouth of the river, there's an old ruin of a castle, but past that leads to a cliff trail around the eastern coastline. I first started exploring this trail with my dog, Maisie, on a very windy, rainy day. We trekked down the cliff trail and onto the bedrocks by the sea, and making our way around the curve of a cliff base, we then found something, littered all over the bedrock floor, were what seemed like dozens of dead seabirds. They were everywhere. It was as though they had just fallen out of the sky and washed ashore. I just assumed they either crashed into the rocks or were swept into the sea due to the stormy weather. Feeling like this was almost a warning, I decided to make my way back home, rather than risk being blown off the cliff trail. It wasn't until a day or so after, when I went back there to explore further down the coast, that a woman and her young daughter stopped me, shouting across the other side of the road through the heavy rain. The woman told me she'd just come from that direction, but that there was a warning sign for dog walkers, warning them that the area was infested with dead seabirds that had died from bird flu. She said the warning had told dog walkers to keep their dogs on a leash at all times, as bird flu was contagious to them. This instantly concerned me, as the day before, my dog Maisie had gotten close to the dead seabirds to sniff them. But there was something else. Something about meeting this woman had struck me as weird. Although she was just a normal woman with her young daughter, they were walking a dog that was completely identical to Maisie, a small black and white border collie. Maybe that's why the woman was so adamant to warn me, because in my dog, she saw her own, heading in the direction of danger. But why this detail was so weird to me was because it almost felt like an omen of some kind. She was leading with her dog identical to mine, away from the contagious dead birds, as though I should have been doing the same. It almost felt as though it wasn't just the woman who was warning me, but something else, something disguised as a coincidence. Curious as to what this warning was, I thanked the woman for letting me know. Before continuing with Maisie towards the trail, we reached the entrance of the castle ruins, and on the entrance gate, I saw the sign she had warned me about. The sign was bright yellow and outlined with contagion symbols. If the woman's warning wasn't enough to make me turn around, this sign definitely was, and so I headed back into town, all the while worrying that my dog might now be contagious. Thankfully, Maisie would be absolutely fine, although I would later learn that bird flu was common to the region, and so dead seabirds weren't anything new. What I would stumble upon a year later, washed up on the town's beach, would definitely be far more sinister. In the summer of the following year, like most days, I walked with Maisie along the town's beach, which stretched from one end of the Thurso Bay to the other. I never really liked this beach because it was always covered in stacks of seaweed, which not only stunk of sulfur, but attracted swarms of flies and midges. Even if they weren't on you, you couldn't help but feel like you were being bitten all over your body. The one thing I did love about this beach was that on a clear enough day, you could see in the distance one of the islands of Orkney. On a more cloudy or foggy day, it was as if this particular island was never there to begin with, and instead, all you would see is the ocean and a false horizon. On one particular summer's day, I was walking with Maisie along this beach. I had let her off her lead as she loved exploring and finding new smells from the ocean. She was rummaging around through the stacks of seaweed when suddenly, Maisie had found something. I went to see what it was, and I realized it was something I'd never seen before. What we found, lying on top of a layer of seaweed, was an animal skeleton. I wasn't sure about the animal it belonged to exactly, but it was either a sheep or a goat. There were many farms in Caithness and across the sea in Orkney. My best guess was that an animal of one of the Orkney's coastal farms must have fallen off a ledge or a cliff, subsequently drowned, and its remains eventually washed up here. Although I was initially taken aback by the skeleton, grinning up at me with its molar-like teeth, something about this animal quickly caught my eye. The upper body was indeed skeletal remains, completely picked clean, but the lower body was still all there. It still had its hoofs and wet fur. The fur was dark gray, and as far as I could see, all the meat underneath was still intact. Although disturbed by this carcass, I was also very confused. What I didn't understand was why had the upper body of this animal been completely picked off, whereas the lower part hadn't even been touched. What was weirder, the lower body hadn't even decomposed yet. It still looked fresh. I can still recollect the image of this dead animal in my mind's eye. At the time, one of the first impressions I had of it was that it seemed almost satanic. It reminded me of the image of Baphomet, a goat's head on a man's body. What made me think this was not only the dark goat-like legs, but also the position the carcass was in. Although the carcass belonged to a goat or sheep, the way the skeleton was positioned almost made it appear hominid. The skeleton was laid on its back, with an arm and a leg on each side of its body. However, what I also have to mention about this incident is that, like the dead seabirds and the warnings of the concerned woman, this skeleton also felt like an omen, a bad omen. I thought it might have been at the time, and to tell you the truth, it was. Not long after finding the skeleton washed up on the town's beach, my personal life suddenly takes a very dark and somewhat tragic downward spiral. I almost wish I could go into details of what happened, as it would only support the idea of how much of a bad omen the skeleton would turn out to be, but it's all rather personal. While I've still lived in this godforsaken place, I've come across one more thing that has washed ashore, and although I can't say whether it was more or less disturbing than the Baphomet-like skeleton I'd found, it was definitely bone-chilling. 6 or so months later, and into the Christmas season, I was still recovering from what personal thing had happened to me, almost foreshadowed by that Baphomet skeleton. It was also around this time that I'd just gotten out of a long-distance relationship and was only now finding closure from it. Feeling as though I had finally gotten over it, I decided I wanted to go on a long hike by myself along the cliff trail east of Thurso. And so, the day after Christmas, Boxing Day, I got my backpack together, packed a lunch for myself, and headed out at 6 a.m. The hike along the trail had taken me all day, and by the evening, I walked so far that I actually discovered what I first thought was a ghost town. What I found was an abandoned port settlement, which had the creepiest looking disperse of old stone houses, as well as what looked like the ruins of an ancient round tower. As it turned out, this was actually the Castletown Heritage Center, a tourist spot It seemed I'd walked so far around the rugged terrain that I was now 10 miles outside of Thurso. On the other side of the settlement were the distant cliffs of Dunnet Bay, which compared to the cliffs I'd already trekked along were far grander. Although I could feel my legs finally begin to give way, and already anticipating a long journey back along the trail, I decided that I was going to cross the bay and reach the cliffs, and then make my way back home. Considering what I would find there, this is the point in the journey where I should have stopped. By the time I was making my way around the bay, it had become very dark. I'd already walked past more than half of the bay, but the cliffs didn't feel any closer. It was at this point when I decided I really needed to turn around, as at night, walking back along the cliff trail was going to be dangerous. And for the parts of the trail that led down to the base of the cliffs, I really couldn't afford for the tide to cut off my route. I made my way back through the abandoned settlement of the Heritage Center, and at night, the settlement definitely felt more like a ghost town. Shining my phone flashlight in the windows of the old stone houses, I was expecting to see a face or something peer out at me. What surprisingly made these houses scarier at night were a handful of old fishing boats that had been left outside of them. The wood they were made from looked very old, and the paint had mostly been weathered off. But what was more concerning was that in this abandoned ghost town of a settlement, I wasn't alone. A van had pulled up, with 3 or 4 young men getting out. I wasn't sure what they were doing exactly, but they were burning things inside of a trash can. What it was they were burning, I don't know, but as I made my way out of the abandoned settlement, every time I looked back at the men by the van, at least one of them was watching me. The abandoned settlement, the creepy men burning things by their van. That wasn't even the creepiest thing I came across on that hike. The creepiest thing I found actually came as soon as I decided to head back home. Before I was even back at the Heritage Center, finally making my way back, I tried retracing my own footsteps along the beach. It was so dark by now that I needed to use my phone flashlight to find them. As I wandered through the darkness, with only the dim brightness of the flashlight to guide me, I came across something. Ahead of me, I could see a dark silhouette of something in the sand. It was too far away for my flashlight to reach, but it seemed to me that it was just a big rock, so I wasn't all too concerned. But for some reason, I wasn't 100% convinced either. The closer I get to it, the more I think it could possibly be something else. I was right on top of it now, and the silhouette didn't look as much like a rock as I thought it did. If anything, it looked more like a very big fish, almost like a tuna fish. I didn't even realize fish could get that big in and around these waters. Still unsure if this was just a rock or a dead fish of sorts, but too afraid to shine my light on it, I decided I was going to touch it with my foot. My first thought was I was going to feel a hard rock beneath me, only to realize the darkness had played a trick on me. I lift up my foot and press it on the dark silhouette, but what I felt wasn't rock hard. It was squidgy. My first reaction was a little bit of shock, because if this wasn't a rock like I originally thought, then it was something else, and had probably once been alive. Almost afraid to shine my light on whatever this was, I finally work up the courage to do it. Hoping this really is just a very big fish, I reluctantly shine my light on the dark, squidgy thing, but what the light reveals is something else. It was a seal, a dead seal pup. Seal carcasses do occasionally wash up in this region, and it wasn't even the first time I saw one. But as I studied this dead seal with my flashlight, feeling my own skin crawl as I did it, I suddenly noticed something alarming. This seal pup had a chunk of flesh bitten out of it. For all I knew, this poor seal pup could have been hit by a boat, and that's what caused the wound. But the wound was round and basically a perfect bite shape. Depending on the time of year, there are orcas around these waters, which obviously hunt seals, but this bite mark was no bigger than what a fully grown seal could make. Did another seal do this, I know other animals will sometimes eat their young, but I've never heard of seals doing this. But what was even worse than the idea that this pup was potentially killed by its own species was that this pup, this poor little seal pup, was missing its skull. Not its head, its skull. The skin was all still there, but it was empty, lying flat down against the sand. Just when I think it can't get any worse than this, I leave the seal to continue my way back, when I come across another dark silhouette in the sand ahead. I go towards it, and what I find is another dead seal pup. But once more, this one had an identical wound, a fatal bite mark. And just like the other one, the skull was missing. I could accept that they'd been killed by either a boat, or more likely from the evidence, an attack from another animal. But how did both of these seals, with the exact same wounds in the exact same place, also have both of their skulls missing? I didn't understand it. These seals hadn't been ripped apart. They only had one bite mark each. Would the seal or seals that killed them really remove their skulls? I didn't know. I still don't. But what I do know is that both of these carcasses were identical, completely identical, which was strange. They had clearly died the same way. I more than likely knew how they died, but what happened to their skulls? As it happens, it's actually common for seal carcasses to be found headless. Apparently, if they've been tumbling around in the surf for a while, the head can detach from the body before washing ashore. The only other answer I could find was scavengers. Sometimes other animals will scavenge the body and remove the head. What other animals that was, I wasn't sure, but at least now, I had more than one explanation as to why these seal pups were missing their skulls, even if I didn't know which answer that was. Although I had now reasoned out the cause of these missing skulls, it still struck me as weird as to how these seal pups were almost identical to each other in their demise. Maybe one of them could lose their skulls, but could that really be the case for both? I suppose so, unlike the other things I found washed ashore. These dead seals thankfully didn't feel like much of an omen. This was just a common occurrence to the region. But growing up most of my life in Yorkshire, England, where nothing ever happens, and suddenly moving to what seemed like the edge of the world, and finding the mutilated remains of animals that you've only ever seen in zoos, it definitely stays with you. For the past 2.5 years that I've been here, I almost do feel as though this region is cursed. Not only because of what I found washed ashore. After all, dead things wash up here all the time. I almost feel like this place is cursed for a number of reasons. Despite the natural beauty all around, this place does somewhat feel like a purgatory, a depressive place that attracts lost souls from all around the UK. Many of the locals leave this place, migrating far down south to places like Glasgow. On the contrary, it seems a fair number of people, like me, have come from afar to live here, mostly retired English couples, who for some reason choose this place above all others to live comfortably before the day they die. Perhaps like me, they thought this place would be idyllic, only to find out that they were wrong. For the rest of the population, they're either drug addicts or convicted criminals, relocated here from all around the country. If anything, you could even say that Caithness is the UK's Alaska, where people come to get far away from their past lives, or even themselves, but instead, amongst the natural beauty, are harassed by a cold, dark, depressing climate. Maybe this place isn't actually cursed. Maybe it really is just a remote area in the far north of Scotland that has, for UK standards, a very unforgiving climate. Regardless, I won't be here for much longer. Maybe the ghosts that followed me here will follow wherever I may end up next. A fair bit of warning. If you do choose to come here, make sure you only come in the summer. But whatever you do, if you have your own personal demons of any kind, whatever you do, just don't move here. Man, I'm glad I found this place to post all my weird stories from the woods here in western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. This is my most recent and the easiest to type out for you now. I'm an avid relic hunter and metal detectorist. I walk creek banks and search for arrowheads, Civil War artifacts, antique bottles, and whatever else. And I've hit my areas hard, so I have to walk further every trip I take out. And some of these spots are pretty far out to begin with. Then I set off walking into the woods. More often than not, I end up trekking back in the dark. That doesn't actually come into play for this story, but it helps set the tone for the kind of guy I am. This story actually starts at a local playground. There's a creek running past that everyone fishes in and swims in during the warmer months. But this was back in winter, and I was alone. I walked about a mile up the creek, just looking around the ground for something to catch my eye. I walked past an old house next to the creek, past the park that always gave me the creeps. I never saw anybody going in or out or whatever else, but there would be lights on at night, and I could feel somebody watching me walk out by the windows every single time. I'd always raise my hand and wave without even looking. Just normal small-town courtesy since I was walking past their house. But today, I just passed right by. No feeling of being watched for once. Maybe they got used to seeing me. I'm trekking along, in my boots in the water, and I make it to a big sandbar near an old bridge. Sandbars are prime territory to find Native American relics, and old bridges are great for old bottles. So I'm slowing down now. I'm kicking rocks over and focusing on every little stone, but it feels like someone is watching me. I look around. Nothing. I can see hundreds of yards in every direction, and there is nothing. I get back to my hunt. I can't shake that feeling in my gut, so I look around again. Nothing. I'm kneeled down on the sandbar, back facing the bank, and out of nowhere, I hear what sounds like an old hillbilly. I am one, by the way, I can say it. Anyway, he says, "Jimmy?" Like a question. Like he thought maybe he recognized me or something. I 100% expected to turn around and see some old man standing there on the bank. But there is no one in sight. He would have had to have been a few feet behind me for me to even hear him, with all the water rushing and other noises. But there was absolutely no one there. I've had lots of weird experiences in the woods, and I plan to come back and post more of them here. But this one freaked me out. I actually got out of the creek bed and walked the bank straight back to my car, and then left. And that is not something I generally do. The voice wasn't threatening, and I don't have any weird feelings other than hearing the voice when no one was there. But I was thoroughly freaked out. The weirdest part is that my name is Jimmy. I expected to see someone I knew standing there, but I was alone. I walked at least 30 minutes to get back to my car, and there was absolutely no one else there. I think maybe I'll go back and see if I can get some answers now that the weather is better. If you guys would like to hear more, let me know. I have quite a few strange stories from my trips out in these mountains. Are there any thoughts on how this voice would know my name? Does anybody have any experience with something similar? I would love to hear it. This is my getting lost in the woods story. I feel like I've seen so many of these, and they're always so relatable. I've been wanting to share my story in one of these subreddits since it happened, so this is it. This happened about 2 years ago. My fiancé, my best friend, and I decided to go to this popular hiking trail near us. The trail leads to a giant rock that hangs off of a cliff. It's a beautiful look over the city I live in. It's a far walk through the woods. You're on the same trail going straight for most of the hike. The trail eventually makes a sharp turn, gets thinner, and gets very steep. You really have to hike up this part, and then you reach an open field. You can see the rock above you. You have to climb up one more path that leads you to the rock. Even though the hike is long, the path is very easy and it's hard to mess up, considering this is the only path in that area of the woods that I've found at least. I've done it multiple times at this point, even hiked down well after midnight after watching fireworks on the 4th of July. Anyways, the three of us decided since we were walking close to the road that leads you to the trail, we were going to go visit. It was about 7 p.m., so it started getting dark really fast. We didn't even make it off of the first part of the trail I already mentioned. It goes straight for about an hour until you get to the sharp turn. We didn't even make it to that. We decided, since it was getting dark, we should turn around. We all had our flashlights on, and everything was normal. We never set foot off the path. The path is pretty much dark, engulfed by the trees, but there is this one spot where the trees open up. You can see the entire downtown area of my city, and it feels very high up because this trail is basically in the middle of the hillside, surrounding the whole town. If you've ever been to Pennsylvania, you get it. We got to the spot where the clearing is, where you can see downtown, but it looked flip-flopped. I don't even really know how to explain it. It looked like the town was flipped, like how you can flip an image on your phone, like someone took the town and flipped it the other way, if you get it. It was late and dark, and we were tired of walking, so I just don't think we really took it seriously when we walked past. I still felt the weird feeling though, and I felt like everything was backwards all of a sudden. That's the only way I can really describe it, backwards. And we all said the same thing to each other. It was my fiancé who said something first, which is just weird because usually he'd be the last to say anything in a situation like that. All he said was that he feels backwards. My best friend freaked out because she gets anxiety like that, and she said that she felt the same way. I mentioned the clearing looked weird, and they all agreed with me. They thought the same thing, but they thought they were being silly. At this point, we should be close to the exit, but it felt like we were going in circles. The path started breaking, like the path wasn't even the same we've been walking on, so we turned back around towards the rock to try to figure out where we were. We came back to the clearing, and it looked so weird that we took pictures. I do have them still if anyone cares, but you wouldn't be able to make out that it looks flipped unless you live in the same town. We knew we were at the clearing though, because it's the only part where the woods clear, and we knew that we were on the right path, as we hadn't gotten off of it. We decided to turn back around towards the exit, but it didn't bring us to the exit. It also didn't bring us to the path that looked wrong and started to break. It was a whole new part of the woods we've never seen before. There was a door in the ground. It looked like a door to a mine maybe. We tried to do research, but there's no evidence of a mine being there. But there is multiple mines in my city, so I wouldn't be surprised if it was just old and wasn't on record. Beside the door was about 5 or 6 white chairs, with what seemed to be white sheets laying on the ground around them, like little pieces of white cloth. Not very big, just pieces. There were also beer bottles. The chairs were in a circle formation, but there was no fire pit in the middle or anything, just the chairs. Looking back, it could have been a little campsite someone made, but man was it scary as fuck at night when you're lost. It really freaked us out, and every time we walked away, it seemed we just made our way back to the chairs and the door. Obviously, we start trying to call and text people we know for help. I even called my parents, but no one answered. It was late, so I guess that makes sense. We are lost, and getting really scared that we're going to have to sleep up there. Eventually, after walking what seemed to be in circles, we just walked out, like so fast, the exit was right there. We just walked on the path for a minute, and out like that. Almost immediately after we leave, I get texts back from people I was trying to get help from. And one more creepy thing, just to put the icing on the cake. There was like 1,032 pictures taken on my fiance's phone at 10:32 p.m., like a burst. It was so weird. The pictures were all just white. It's also weird how his phone took pictures while he had his flashlight on at the same time. The pictures were taken during the time we were lost. We didn't go back for about a year until my fiance and I decided to go back and try to find the path we made it onto. It was just for peace of mind. We couldn't find it. We couldn't find the door. We couldn't find anything weird, except a giant meat grinder. I hate the woods so much. It freaks me out thinking about any woods or forests of any kind. That's just one of the worst experiences for me, but I have had a few. Honestly, I just hope people don't think I'm bullshitting. It sounds crazy to me, so I can't imagine someone thinking I'm lying, but I'm really just looking for a possible explanation. It's one of those things that bothers me to this day, and my fiance doesn't like talking about it because there's just no explanation. My best friend and I will still talk about it, but it goes nowhere because we've thought of every possible explanation we can think of. So any similar experiences or theories would be great. Hey everyone. For about 2 weeks, I've been hearing something weird in the woods. My house is on top of a steep hill. The bottom is sort of deep terrain, and my house is surrounded by woods. Before, I heard this noise that would go, "Ooh, yep," a bit low-pitched, and it scared me bad. It stopped all of a sudden. Then a couple of days would go by, and a new noise would arrive. This one goes, "Yee." It's very persistent and more high-pitched than the other one. My owls love making noise at night, but ever since this thing came in, they stopped completely, and they'll wait till morning. Anytime they would try to make their nightly calls, this thing would come in aggressively with that sound to make them stop. Now, every night at 12 a.m., it makes this noise. Sometimes it's far, sometimes it's close, but it's closer now. I've lived here for so long and heard all types of things, but this one, I don't know. I'm hoping it's just some animal and not an exotic one that got loose, but I can't find the one that sounds like it. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that. If you have a scary story you'd like me to read on the channel, please send me an email or post it to my subreddit. You can find details of this in the video description. It's the stories that make this, and this is the best way to ensure variety in the stories I share. Thank you all for listening, and a special thanks to my channel members and patrons who now have special access to ad-free videos and other behind-the-scenes content. Once again, thank you guys for listening. Have a great night.